Good evening. Welcome to the Chatham Marconi Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart, and I'm a volunteer here at the Center. We are so pleased you have joined us this evening. Tonight, we're going to go back in time to the beginnings of Marconi's transatlantic communication from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. As a reminder, you can pose your questions during the presentation in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. Click on the box, type your question in, and we'll have our speaker answer as many questions at the end of the program as possible. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Matthew Cook. Matt is the National Historic Site and Visitor Experience Manager at Marconi National Historic Site of Canada in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. He also manages the Alexander Graham Bell, Canso Islands, and St. Peter's Canal National Historic Sites. He has degrees in history and commerce and has worked with Parks Canada for the past 14 years. Matt grew up a few miles down the shore from the site of Marconi's Glace Bay transmission station. So welcome, Matt. We are so pleased you joined us tonight.
Thank you.
So I'll turn the presentation over to you now.
Okay, great. As Liz said, I am Matthew Cook. Good evening. I grew up a few miles down the shore from Marconi's Tablehead Station in Glace Bay. And when I was in elementary school, a museum was built at the site of the ruins. And as was mentioned, I'm now the site manager of a series of National Historic Sites administered by Parks Canada, including Marconi National Historic Site. These are sites that are operated by Parks Canada, and at Parks Canada, we protect and present nationally significant examples of Canada's natural and cultural heritage and foster public understanding, appreciation, and enjoyment in ways that ensure the ecological and commemorative integrity of these places for present and future generations. To say this is a dream job is an understatement. I also, amongst the sites I manage, Canso, St. Peter's, and Alexander Graham Bell National Historic Site, we have a brilliant team of guides, interpreters, and maintenance crew that welcome about 90,000 visitors a year to these places. Also along this coast are, and these are from the top, Louisbourg, Fortress of Louisbourg, Canso Islands, clockwise, St. Peter's Canal, and Alexander Graham Bell National Historic Sites. And also along this coast are other important historic places. Just down the shore is Port Morion, which is the site of the first coal mine in North America, which opened in 1720 to provide coal for the Fortress of Louisbourg, and the Fortress of Louisbourg itself that you can see on the screen here. So top left of the screen on my screen is the Fortress of Louisbourg. So this French fortified city was central to the struggle for supremacy between the French and the British for North America. It was so expensive to build that Louis XIV, or was it the 15th, expected to see its spires on the horizon from France. And throughout all these time periods, and since time immemorial, this place has been and is the unceded traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who call the island.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. Can you hide the little bar at the bottom? Sorry, go ahead.
That just popped.
Thank you.
Okay. This is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who call the island of Cape Breton Unama'ki. So let's talk about the man himself and the significance of Glace Bay to wireless. And I think I have stopped sharing, is that right?
Yes, Matt, you've stopped sharing. You want to try that again?
Nope, that's good. That's what I want. So Marconi's greatest desire was to have wireless span the ocean, an endeavor he called the Big Thing, a code that would keep his plans secret. He'd been trying to span the Atlantic Ocean via wireless telegraphy from stations in Poldhu, Cornwall, and Cape Cod, Massachusetts. After a storm destroyed much of the Poldhu station and a temporary antenna was raised, Marconi decided to try to receive transmissions from a location 600 miles closer to England than Massachusetts, in Newfoundland. And as it happens, the Cape Cod station blew down in a storm just before he left for Newfoundland. The Dominion of Newfoundland was a country at the time, one of the original British dominions, along with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and wouldn't become a Canadian province until 1949. Newfoundland at the time was of great strategic interest to Canada, Britain, and the United States because of its location at the northeast edge of the continent. He cabled Poldhu to transmit the 3 dots signifying an S. And on December 12, 1901, with balloons and antennas at a high point in St. John's, Marconi received the first wireless transatlantic signal. The cable companies were big business, and Marconi's wireless method of communication was a threat to their existence and their profits. The Anglo-American Telegraph Company had a monopoly on communication in Newfoundland, and they threatened to sue Marconi if he didn't stop doing telegraphic communication in Newfoundland. So rather than face off against them, Marconi left. He likely would have returned to Cape Cod, except for some quick Canadian political maneuverings. William Smith, the Secretary of the Canadian Post Office, was in Newfoundland when Marconi announced he was leaving. And Smith intended to discuss the situation with the Canadian Postmaster General, but he was away at the time, so Smith went to the Minister of Finance, who also happened to be the former Premier of Nova Scotia, William S. Fielding. Fielding immediately invited Marconi to continue his experiments in Canada. The Canadian government threw everything it could at Marconi to entice him to locate in Nova Scotia. Use of the railway between North Sydney and Montreal, assigning the secretary to the post office to Marconi as an attaché, a welcome akin to a royal visit when he arrived from Newfoundland by ship in North Sydney with representatives of the Canadian and Nova Scotia governments, including the Premier of Nova Scotia. The promise of assistance from the Dominion Coal Company, which placed its railways and tugs at Marconi's disposal and granted him unrestricted use of the land where he eventually erected his station. Even Alexander Graham Bell, summer resident of Baddeck, Cape Breton, offered the use of his property. The gratuitous use of assets was very important for a company that was financially struggling and had not yet turned a profit. And this was just the beginning of what the Canadian government would offer. Marconi contemplated 4 different locations for the site of his permanent station along the coast. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's moving down at the bottom of the screen. And this is the community of Louisbourg. So this is one of the places where that was in consideration for a permanent station. Burying Ground Point in Louisbourg. And now you'll find an annual archaeology program which aims to save from coastal erosion the remains of mainly 18th century New Englanders that are buried there. Further up the coast, up here is Port Morion, where, as I said, was the location of the first coal mine in North America. Manadoo, which is down here, a little further down the shore, and Tablehead, a barren promontory in the town of Glace Bay. While Cape Breton is known for its pleasant climate in spring, summer, and fall, and it's been ranked the #1 island in North America by Condé Nast Traveler and #1 island in Canada by Travel and Leisure, Marconi came in late December 1901 and toured these places in blinding snow and rainstorms on high seas. His plan for one of these places was to go beyond the experimental kite-based tests performed in Newfoundland and erect aerials of 150-foot poles to receive and transmit messages across the Atlantic. He needed a location with proximity to water, where equipment could be transported easily, where there was no radio interference, and which had a good line of sight to Cornwall. Marconi went to Ottawa to negotiate at the highest levels of the Canadian government, the Post Office, the Minister of Finance, and the Prime Minister himself, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who you'll find on the $5 note if you've ever seen one. The resulting contract showed just how important the relationship was to both parties. The Canadian government was interested in long-distance wireless telegraphy because of the sheer size of the country across which it needed to communicate. And Marconi had limited financial resources and needed government support for his venture. So the agreement was as follows. The Canadian government would pay up to $80,000 to erect the station. That's over $2 million today. The cost of ordinary wireless messages wouldn't exceed 10 cents per word, while the government and press would pay 5 cents per word. The government could erect coastal stations using Marconi's system, which they would buy from Marconi companies at fair prices, but without having to pay royalties or patent rights. Marconi companies could keep any tolls they charged for transmissions. Wherever possible, Marconi would use Canadian machinery, labor, and materials. He could access government-controlled telegraph lines for free. The government waived customs duties on equipment imports, and the Canadian government provided him a steamer to conduct tests. The lobby for Glace Bay, one of the 4 communities, wanted even more: electric rates at almost wholesale prices and a 10-year exemption from taxes in order to secure the economic benefits that would surely result from the construction of the station. Meanwhile, the cable companies continued to challenge his credibility. They said that the S signal he received in Newfoundland was just interference rather than the S transmitted from England. And they said the curvature of the Earth prevented long-distance wireless communications. Radio waves simply went straight into outer space. Marconi continued to work on his research and testing, including the sensitivity of instrumentation used on ships. He spent 2 years trying to work out how to make his receiving apparatus less sensitive to movements on ships at sea. And the solution finally came to him while he was cycling on the Isle of Wight in June 1902. And he invented the new magnetic detector in 15 minutes. Before completing negotiations with Canada, he had unprecedented success in experimentation at sea. Until now, the maximum distance wireless messages could be received at sea was 250 miles. Using the 170-foot masts of the ship Philadelphia between Cherbourg, France, and New York, and using a Morse inker that produced blue dots and dashes, printed blue dots and dashes, Marconi and observers from the ship's crew received signals at 500, 1,000, and 2,099 miles, further than the distance between Poldhu and St. John's, which proved that long-distance wireless communication over the Atlantic was possible. Richard Vivian was a trusted engineer in Marconi's employ. Vivian had identified weaknesses in the Cape Cod and Poldhu aerials and predicted their collapse. So Marconi left him in charge of the construction of the Glace Bay station. Rhodes, Curry and Company of Amherst, Nova Scotia got the contract to build the station, which would include 4 towers, a powerhouse, an operations building, and a manager's residence. The company was not the lowest bidder, but Marconi insisted on top quality materials and workmanship. The company was the same one that the Dominion Coal Company contracted to build company houses for its miners. And many of these duplexes and large single-family homes still stand in Cape Breton today, a testament to quality materials and workmanship. Tablehead in Glace Bay was a much larger station than in Poldhu. The 75 kilowatt alternator had 3 times the power, and the building that housed the wireless plant was 4 times the size. Tablehead's towers were made of pine, 210 feet high, placed in a square that was 200 feet on each side. 4 massive cables, 3 inches in diameter, supported 400 copper wires that made up the antenna system. These wires came into the powerhouse in the shape of an inverted cone. Next to the 55 by 51 foot powerhouse was the 70 by 51 foot operating building. These were about 2 stories high, or 20 feet. The manager's house was a 12-room, 1-story building, which was shared by Vivian, the staff of electrical engineers, and Marconi whenever he was in Cape Breton. And just as he had in any house he owned, there was a piano. Surrounding this complex was a barbed wire fence that guarded the secrecy of Marconi's work. By the end of June in 1902, that's within 3 months of starting construction, the towers were constructed, the aerials installed, the generators and steam engines were running, and testing began. Having been gone for months experimenting and testing in Russia, North Africa, and the Atlantic, Marconi returned to Glace Bay on October 31st, 1902, on an Italian Navy ship, the Carlo Alberto, which the Italian government had put at his disposal to use as a laboratory at the insistence of the king. He planned to stay in Glace Bay for 2 weeks to install equipment and conduct tests, but his work kept him here for 3 months. All during this time, newspapers speculated on his experiments and contradictory reports were published. The world was abuzz with the talk of Marconi and whether wireless telegraphy could span the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, Marconi and his associates were not having a good time. Every test at Tablehead in November failed. And remember, all these engineers and Marconi were living in close proximity in the same house and working together every day. The Italian Navy ship had to leave him behind. He had to postpone his planned trip to South Wellfleet, where he needed to test that new station. Finally, he decided that Poldhu's power supply was insufficient. So he reversed the experiments and began to try to relay signals from Tablehead to Poldhu, because Tablehead had a larger power capacity. It was later determined that they were transmitting a 2,000 meter wavelength when one of 6,000 to 8,000 meters was required. But they didn't have that knowledge or the instruments to measure wavelengths at the time. Finally, after many adjustments to the aerial and doing such things as increasing the length of the secondary spark, some weak readable signals were reported from Poldhu on December 5th. But the next 2 nights, using exactly the same aerial arrangements, nothing. Finally, after more adjustments, on December 14th, 1902, Poldhu reported receiving readable messages for 2 hours. He had done it. The big thing was realized. Now the time had come to settle all doubts about his success. With financial pressure and press criticism on his mind, especially the doubts about his success in Newfoundland, Marconi invited a correspondent to the Times of London to send the first official transatlantic message. On December 15th, 1902, George Parkin transmitted the following from Table Head, and it was received at Poldhu. Times, London, being present at transmission in Marconi's Canadian station, have the honor to send through Times inventor's first transatlantic message of greetings to England and Italy. Celebrations ensued? No, it was a further 6 days before that message could be delivered to the Times, because Marconi wanted to follow protocol and send messages to the kings of Great Britain and Italy first. But generator breakdowns and other obstacles prevented these messages to the kings from getting through. The station struggled with inconsistent transmissions. They varied from good, reliable signals to absolutely nothing within a 2 to 3 minute time span, with Marconi and his colleagues unable to find the problem or a solution. But once the Times message got through, everyone wanted to send messages by wireless, and there was a backlog of messages to send. Commercial activity had to take place to maintain investor confidence. The inconsistencies in reliable signals meant that between December 15th and January 20th, only 38 messages were sent. That's an average of about 1 a day. Some had to be repeated 24 times before they were successfully received. Others were received successfully each time they were sent. The inconsistencies were very frustrating. But on January 10th, 1903, Marconi departed Glace Bay for Cape Cod to establish transatlantic wireless communications between America and England. Messages would be sent from Cape Cod to Glace Bay and then on to Poldhu. More than a month after the first Glace Bay transmission, on January 19th, 1903, wireless messages between President Roosevelt and King Edward VII were sent from Cape Cod directly to Poldhu, bypassing Glace Bay. This direct transmission from Cape Cod was accidental, but the size of the station's power supply didn't lend to a regular direct link to England. Marconi's operations were not yet ready for commercial transatlantic wireless service, and over the next little while, improvements were made at Poldhu and problems solved at Glace Bay, including the collapse of the antenna after a buildup of ice on the lines. This silver thaw was something not seen by Marconi's engineers elsewhere. Before this collapse, there was a brief transatlantic news service between Canada and England, the first in history. And all the while, ship-to-shore transmissions provided news to sailing ships and onboard newspapers. These shore stations were very successful, and they provided significant revenues to Marconi's companies. But the reliable wireless transmission required to make Table Head profitable just could not be achieved. So in 1905, the station was dismantled and moved to a location near Port Morion, just down the shore, which became known as Marconi Towers. The new station was larger than Table Head and had 22 buildings, including a condenser building, an engine and machine shop, staff residence, livery stable, blacksmith shop, and the manager's residence where Marconi stayed whenever he was in Cape Breton. And it still stands today. A more powerful station was constructed at Clifton, Ireland, and by February 1908, unlimited commercial wireless service between North America and Europe was a reality. Another setback for Marconi, the transmission and receiver building at Marconi Towers burnt in 1909, and he had to rebuild. All but 2 of the buildings were incinerated, along with all the equipment, but he persevered with a team of equally enthusiastic, hardworking colleagues. Always wanted to muck in with his workers, Marconi spent several months personally supervising the redesign and reconstruction of the station. He worked alongside engineers, staff, and 40 laborers, pouring 20,000 gallons of acid into 6,600 cell storage battery that was charged by a group of 5,000 volt DC generators and a huge condenser. They laid a 30,000 volt cable and 10 miles of joints in frozen trenches. The work was 18 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week for months. The receiver building was moved half a mile away from the transmitter. In the meantime, the Clifton station was enlarged and modernized so that both stations had the latest advances in radio telegraphy. It was 8 months before the two stations were reopened for service. In 1913, Marconi introduced the duplex system, sending signals in both directions simultaneously. Marconi Towers continued as the transmitting station, and a new receiving station was required to be built at Lewisburg, further down the shore. It was in Lewisburg where wireless voice transmission was first heard in 1919 from Ireland. And the same year, the Canadian Marconi Company opened its first commercial radio station located in Montreal. But shortwave technology eventually made Cape Breton's longwave stations obsolete. They were closed to commercial traffic in 1926. The Lewisburg station was scheduled to close in 1927 because of new stations opened in Quebec, but it was destroyed by fire before that could happen and was never reopened. The Marconi Towers station continued to service ships as VAS, the voice of the Atlantic seaboard, until 1946, when it was sold to a private individual, and the property is still owned by that family. The visitor center that you see here is built on the site of the original Tablehead station, just meters south of where the four towers were erected. The concrete bases of the towers can still be seen. The center was designed and created by Parks Canada with the support of various other government, private, and charitable organizations. As you approach the visitor center, you'll see a stone monument with a commemorative plaque placed by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, which designated this a national historic site on May 19th, 1938. Inside, you'll be greeted by a bust of Marconi, carved from Italian marble, under a graphic of his signature. The text on all the exhibit panels are in English, French, and Italian, and the colors inside represent the theme of international cooperation. English appears on red panels, French on blue, and Italian on green. In the center of the visitor center is a large, meticulously detailed scale model of the original station, showing the buildings, towers, aerial array, and the cliffs on the Atlantic Ocean. The walls surrounding the model display a chronological exhibit of Marconi's life and work, using historical photos, text, and artifacts, with stands that look like communication towers. Next to the model, you can activate an electronic display on the wall above that shows the various routes of signals from Cape Breton and Newfoundland to and from England and Ireland. There's a video presentation on Marconi's work that culminated in the Big Thing at Glace Bay, produced by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and RAI, the Italian network. Behind the information counter is Station VAS, Voice of the Atlantic Seaboard, a functioning amateur radio station operated by members of the Sydney Amateur Radio Club. Volunteers from the club transmit and receive messages from all over the world. Right now, we are procuring a new antenna and updated radio equipment. Outside, there is an interpretive trail on the site of the original station. On a barren promontory jutting out into the Atlantic, you can see the ruins of the original towers and gaze out at the ocean. Along the short walk are interpretive panels, and there's plenty of room to picnic and contemplate the events of 100+ years ago, not far from a bustling downtown. Although only officially open from Canada Day, July 1st, until Labor Day, we open for school groups and occasional visitors from abroad on demand when we can. We get a few thousand visitors a year from all over the world. Perhaps the greatest book on Marconi's time in Canada that I could recommend is Dr. Mary K. McLeod's Whisper in the Air, Canada, the Marconi Years, 1902 to 1946. The publishing house is no more, but the book can be found on Amazon. I highly recommend this if you want more detail on Marconi's work in Cape Breton. And that concludes my talk on Marconi and the significance of Glace Bay to the development of wireless. The Marconi name is still a very familiar one here, where we have the Marconi Trail, a coastal highway that connects the communities where he worked, the Marconi campus of the Nova Scotia Community College, and Marconi National Historic Site.
Thank you, Matt. That was fascinating and really enlightening about Marconi's involvement in Glace Bay, as well as his work in Canada. Interestingly, his involvement with the Canadian government as well. Just a reminder to our audience, you can pose questions, and we already have some coming through in the Q&A box in the at the bottom of your screen. First, Matt, you mentioned that in I think it was 1903, that Marconi moved the Glace Bay site, if you will, to Marconi Towers, or 1905, to the Marconi Tower site because the transmission was not reliable. Why wasn't it reliable at Glace Bay?
I'm not a technocrat when it comes to the technical details on how wireless works, but from what I recall, it required a bigger station with more power, and Marconi wasn't willing to invest in the same location because the transmission had been unreliable. So he moved it to a much larger site, slightly inland, and with a lot more power resources.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, being right on the coast there, certainly probably subjected to some fierce weather up there.
Definitely fierce weather. Yep.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And the towers that he built the towers that he moved to Marconi Towers were the original pine towers, and they became something of a tourist attraction. So the Sydney and Louisbourg Railway was the only way to get there. Roads. This was at the beginning of the 20th century, and roads in the area weren't as good as they are now. But the railway line was very good. So the railway went directly past the property, and the tourists would actually a separate train was put on for tourists, and they would stop at the Marconi Towers location just to see this massive piece of infrastructure, all these buildings and these massive towers. And Marconi always modernizing. Eventually, those 4 towers were removed, and 20 steel towers were replaced them. And there was actually some disappointment in the community because those original towers meant so much to the people that had seen them, and they had become so iconic.
Yeah, it must have been quite a sight. So speaking of getting to Glace Bay and tourism, Chris has a question, and I'm not sure where Chris is located, but he wants to know how does one get to Glace Bay today?
Glace Bay is situated about 20 minutes from Sydney, which is I guess the shire town of Cape Breton County. The city, it was once a city, the only city on the island, and the whole area is composed of industrial, former mining and steelworking communities. So there's a lot of large communities next to one another. So you can get here from by air to Sydney Airport, which is directly in between Sydney and Glace Bay. There are direct flights from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Montreal, Quebec, and Toronto, Ontario. And also you can travel by road to, from mainland Nova Scotia and the Trans-Canada Highway, which takes you anywhere in Canada. Cruise ships also stop at the Port of Sydney from, I guess, May till October. So quite a number of people visit the museums and historic sites when they get off cruise ships.
Thank you. Hopefully that was helpful. We have a question from Ed, and he'd like to know what share of transatlantic messages were handled by the Clifton Circuit as compared to the share handled by the cable.
That I don't know. I'm not a Marconi expert, but I bet there would be the answer to that could be found in one of the books that I consulted. One of the great books is this one. I think it's fairly new. Marconi, the Man Who Networked the World by Mark Raboy, I believe it is. This is a very substantial book that would probably have the answer to that.
Okay, we do have that book in our museum shop, so it's a well-known book.
It's on audiobook as well.
Great, thank you. Ron, another viewer, says, excellent presentation, and he'd like to know, is the amateur radio station active?
It is. This group of people, I know they meet on a regular basis in Sydney, and they volunteer while the museum is open at the museum. So you'll find them transmitting from the museum in July and August and into the first part of September. The last couple of years, they weren't there because of the COVID pandemic, and we have to replace some equipment. But with the new equipment hopefully being set up for this July, you should be able to make contact with them at that time. What we're going to do is when we have a schedule of the dates that they will be volunteering there, we'll post it on our Facebook page.
Oh, that's great. Our museum also is the home of WCC, an amateur radio station. So maybe there can be a connection. Do your operators use Morse code or voice?
As far as I know, they use both, but they definitely use voice.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tom has a question. Did Marconi have challenges getting trained operators for the operation?
I think a lot of workers came from the local area for construction, but in terms of the engineers, I'm not entirely sure, but I have read that he imported workers from other places. At one point, a whole new crew of operators came here to Glace Bay because the Glace Bay contingent was relocated to South Africa. So I think he had people from other places that he brought with him, and that's why they would live in the residences that he built here.
Thank you. Oh, Ron, in response to your answer on the radio station, amateur radio station, is going to try to reach out to them when they're on the air. So thank you, Ron. John has a question. He says, aside from government subsidy, where does the museum get its support?
There's a donation box at the museum, but other than that, this particular museum and all the historic sites all the national historic sites in the area and in the country are funded by the Government of Canada. Parks Canada is an agency of the Department of the Environment.
Thank you. Okay, so it looks like those are all the questions we have, and we really appreciate your time, Matt. I hopefully we'll have some visitors to your museum, and please feel free to come down and visit with us.
I would love to.
To make sure that you do, we are going to send you a Chatham Marconi. You are now going to be a member of Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. We'll send you that. And when you come, you can wear your Chatham Marconi Maritime hat. Okay, so we'll get that off in the mail, and hopefully see you one day. So thanks again for all the great information as well as the references. We'll have to check out that book that you mentioned. And I want to also thank our audience for attending and viewing tonight. We appreciate your support. Our museum is now open for the season. We are on summer hours, which are Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 4, and Sunday, 1 to 4. So we hope to see our viewers at our museum as well. Thank you again, Matt, and have a good night.
Thank you.